good afternoon to Professor John Piggott in Australia, and good evening for participants in the North American continent. This is welcome to our panel, the first panel of this conference, Global Trend in Aging and Economic Impacts. My name is Sarah Tong. I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. Since we have some technical issue, getting in touch with Professor Cannon. So for this panel, we're going to at this point we'll have two speakers. Let me briefly introduce our two very distinguished speakers. As we just had a very nice, very good keynote speech from Senior Minister Taman. This conference, we're looking at the aging issues, in particular a few issues that's very much the focus of our discussion, the global trend, how technology interact in this trend, or in this dealing with the aging issue, in particular in Asia as well as in China, as we had heard. The other issue on the aging issue, how human capital investment as well as labor market government policies are going to help. I'm very honored and privileged to moderate this session with our two immensely good researchers or top expert, Professor John Piggott and Professor Andrew Mason. Professor Piggott is director of the Australian Research Centre of Excellence of Population Aging Research at the University of New South Wales. He has done many research and publication on issues of retirement, pension issues, and in public finance in general. We're going to listen to his discussion today on the issues of technology aging trend and how technology and aging issues are interacting. Our second speaker today is Professor Andrew Mason from the University or Emerite Professor of Economics from University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's currently adjunct fellow, senior fellow at the East West Center. He has done many work, tremendous research on particularly population dividends or in terms of productivity and economic development. Without further ado, may I introduce Professor John Piggott to give the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a great honor to be leading off the first panel session at this very prestigious conference. And the work I'm going to present was actually initially inspired by the Asian Development Bank, and it was also in association with the Pacific Rim Universities Association, the Association for Pacific Rim Universities. So I need to acknowledge both those, and it was done jointly with my colleague, Rafal Chomik. So it's around the interaction between demographic change and technological development. So there's quite a lot of work, and what the impacts are on the labor market. So there's quite a lot of work about how aging impacts labor markets, and there's quite a lot of work about how technical change impacts labor markets, but actually they interconnect very strongly, and there's very little work on that interaction, particularly when you look at work that's being done in Asia. And so this particular presentation is about what evidence we can bring to bear on those dual trends and their interaction. Next slide, please. So this is actually quite a messy topic, and we've tried to distill what we have learned down to 4 questions. And they are, will aging inhibit or will it encourage productivity growth? And then, is technical change age biased in labour markets? We hear quite a lot about skill bias, but there's very little work actually on age bias. And then, can technologies actually help with later life? What are the ways in which assistive technologies might relieve the pressures of aging? And finally, what are the policy challenges and what are the knowledge gaps? Now, the work that we did with the ADB was produced as a CPAR discussion paper a year or so ago, and you'll find that at that website that you can see on the bottom of the screen. So I only have 20 minutes and I won't be able to cover everything that we have in the paper, but I will do my best to give the broad themes. We take evidence in doing this from many sources. Sometimes these sources are a little bit inconsistent with one another. We just drew on what we could because what we really wanted to do was to assemble the evidence and draw what insights we could from that evidence. Next slide, please. So the first observation is that workforces are indeed aging. So usually we get to this slide as a result of looking at demographic change and so forth, but you can see for a number of Asian economies there, Korea, China, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, there is this sharp movement when you look at the population aged 50 to 64 as a proportion of the population aged 20 to 64. So the share of mature workers. And you can see how rapidly it's increasing. Sometimes this has happened in the past, as in the case of Japan. Other times it's about to happen, as in the case of Malaysia or Indonesia. But in all cases, the trend is sharply up. To give you just some idea of the quantum, in Japan, people aged 50 to 65 went from 20% in 2000 to 33% now, and in Korea, from 18% in 1995 to 35% now. So you can see it's a very big movement. Next slide, please. So Asia also has quite a lot more technical innovation. And in talking about technical innovation, I want to sort of split that a little bit and think about both new innovation that actually pushes out the production possibility frontier and gives more technical possibilities to everybody, but also the diffusion of existing technologies. And that is probably the more powerful force in Asia today. But here we're looking at patent applications. And you can see in the last 20 years or so that some countries like China have moved up in terms of patent applications per million population to countries like the USA. And countries like Korea and Japan have had a long tradition of innovation in this kind of space. Other countries, not so much. If you take Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia, they lie further down. I've lost the slide. There they are back. Next slide, please. But if we think of diffusion, if we think of taking the existing technology and spreading it, and here what we've used, we have to use just very crude measures. Here we've used the share of the population using the internet over the period between 1990 and 2016. And you can see that share has increased dramatically over that time span. And this is internet use at work, right? So Asia varies a lot in terms of diffusion capability, but you can see that in all cases, that technical diffusion is spreading. And that means that technology is becoming more and more of a potent force in the labor market. Next slide, please. So this first question then is, will aging inhibit productivity growth? Next slide, please. So linking productivity to these various forces is quite complicated. So you can think of changes in productivity being expressed, if you like, or having as conduits changes in physical capital, changes in the quality of human capital, and actually changes in the menu of techniques that might be available. And then within that, there is infrastructure, there's production, there's health, there's education, and there's also sort of governance, how well countries manage the rapid changes that they are undertaking, how well they manage financial markets, for example. So all that feeds through into invention and into innovation and into diffusion, right? So the question is, how does aging impact on these? For example, if you think of the availability of physical capital, you might think, well, there's a life cycle saving which is taking place, what the next bigger Andy might call the second demographic dividend. And because that life cycle saving is taking place, we have resources available for investment in physical capital and, for that matter, also in human capital. Or you might say, well, the human capital, because of the rapid changing technology, human capital is becoming obsolete, and that's going to slow productivity growth. And that might be true, but as well, aging means there's massive innovation in medical technology. And so balancing these different forces out, right, is not a straightforward matter. Take human capital. Older people are less educated. The population is aging. That's one reason that we're looking at this. And so there is now greater investment in fewer children. And so human capital may be increasing and increasing productivity through that conduit. So these are very complicated interactions that we are examining. Next slide, please. So what does the empirical literature say? So the way we tried to tackle this was to think, first of all, of the individual, and then of teams or firms, groups of individuals that were put together to produce a given output, and finally, an economy-wide aggregate. Next slide, please. So productivity by age at the individual level. This is the domain of psychologists. And so we looked at psychometric measurement. And we looked specifically at intelligence. And what we found was that psychologists have divided intelligence into two broad buckets. One of them they call fluid intelligence, which is sort of biology-based. It's this capacity to very spontaneously respond. Very mathematics, for example, mathematical innovation relies heavily on fluid intelligence. And that peaks quite early, and that's the red line that you see there. But there is also a second bucket called crystallized intelligence, which is what I have. And this crystallized intelligence is more knowledge-based, and it doesn't go down nearly so fast. Right? So if you measure that, you find fluid intelligence peaks earlier and declines, but crystallized intelligence stays high for a long period of time. And so depending upon the nature of the task, the nature of what's required of someone in a job, crystallized intelligence can dominate fluid intelligence in terms of its utility in the labor market. And that can happen until well beyond the sorts of ages of retirement that we are currently observing. Next slide, please. So there's a number of ways of approaching this question at the team level or the plant level or the firm level. What we have done here is to assemble a number of different studies which have looked at the age distribution of the labor force in firms, right? And what they do essentially is they take some measure of central tendency in that age. It might be the mean or it might be the median age of workers. And then they look at all the firms that they have in their sample and they say which are the most productive. And from that they take, well, this is the most productive age. Right? So there are a dozen or so studies like this. And it's kind of interesting. What you find is that maximum productivity tends to be 40 plus, right? That sort of central line, that's where most of these grey bars lie. The one exception is a firm of information and communication technology, an ICT firm, or a set of ICT firms in Belgium, and that led to high productivity being at a very young age, right? But most of the others, manufacturing or more general populations of firms, there was this kind of middle ground, middle age being peak productivity. And this actually illustrates one of the great difficulties of working in this space, because what we are observing here is not a population, we are observing workers. And in trying to get a handle on how productivity and how individuals interact with technology to be productive, you have got to remember that it's the older workers who are successful in the labour force that appear in these studies. People who are not successful in the labour force will likely have dropped out. And so immediately you have a problem with selection. So selection and cohort effects bedevil very clear evidence in this space. Next slide, please. So what about the aggregate level? Well, the study that I think best, there are two. One is a study that looked at very many countries and very many industries for the 50 to 64 age group. And what they found was that where that was emphasized, that 50 to 64 age group, and this is over a long period, 1950 to 1990, this was the OEC study at around the turn of the century, that actually had a positive impact on labor productivity. So that was quite interesting. And then a number of other studies have found the same thing. So those top studies, and then when you come to the US, it seems to go the other way. The labor productivity gets negative for older workers. But one thing that might be happening, and I have the bottom study circled in red for this reason, one thing that might be happening is that you might be getting an induced technology change. So what might be happening is that there has been a change in the amount of investment in new technology because of the change in the age distribution of the labor force. So that's an example of an interaction, right, which I think needs to be given good attention in trying to get a handle on how these two megatrends interact. Next slide, please. Okay, so here what we're looking at is a very crude measure of induced technical change. So we're looking at workforce aging, the change in the ratio of the population aged more than 50 as a ratio of 20 to 49 over a period of 25 years between 1990 and 2015. And then we're going to use as our measure of technical change the change in the number of robots per million hours worked over roughly the same period. And you can see that there is a positive correlation there. And what we've done is we've kind of put into red the Asian economies, right? But all in the study, the actual study, there were many European economies and America and so forth as well. Right? But you can see there is a positive story there. So the argument basically is that the scarcity of younger and middle-aged workers can induce capital investment and automation that increases output per person. Next slide, please. And here we're looking at the human side. And what we find, of course, once again, is that as per capita income increases, life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, and education all increase. So what we've got here is healthy life expectancy at birth. And you can see that going up in all these countries throughout Asia. And those increases will have their flow-on effects into increased labor productivity. Next slide, please. So what conclusions can we draw so far? Well, first of all, the Asian region is undergoing rapid population aging. There's growth in innovation and technical innovation and diffusion especially. And I want to emphasize that question of diffusion, particularly in emerging Asia. And they've been very strong through Asia in the last quarter century, but not even. So there's quite a lot of disparity across countries. We've seen that there are many avenues through which aging might impact productivity growth, and the net effect is not clear. And the actual answer to that question might vary between countries, between industries, and so forth. And the potential ability of individuals at mature age presents a different profile from those of young individuals, but not necessarily indicative of lower productivity. And it's worth bearing in mind all through this that successive cohorts are better educated, are likely to enjoy improving health, and these are important positive impacts on productivity growth. Next slide, please. So the second question is technology change age biased? Next slide, please. So we begin with skill-biased technological change, and this is very much connected with the work of David Autor from MIT. And what he did was to try to break occupations down into skill levels. So he said just looking at an occupation really didn't do the trick. And he used the example of bank tellers. He said in America, there are more bank tellers now than there were before the invention of ATMs. What's happened is the nature of being a bank teller, the characteristics of that occupation has changed. So he tried to overcome that by breaking occupations down into skills, right? So occupation skill. And he had low, middle, and high. So low-skilled occupations are very intensive in non-routine and manual skills. Middle-skilled occupations, routine cognitive and manual skills. So counting out money behind a bank wicket. And then there are high-skilled occupations which are very intensive in non-routine cognitive and interpersonal skills. And what you find is that across many of these countries, and we have in red the name or the acronym for the country where it appears in Asia, the middle-skilled occupation intensity, that employment share tended to go down. Right? This is a period now between 1990 and 2012, except for China, where it shot up. So this is actually indirect evidence of offshoring, I think, that China improved its ratio of these middle-skilled occupations very dramatically. I don't think that would be true if we took this sample out for another 10 years, but it's true for this sample. Whereas the high-skilled occupations, well, they went up in many cases, and so did low-skilled. So it was that middle, that routine story where reasonably simple computer-based technology could take the place of human work. To see how this works, there was a study done in Asia, in Malaysia. Next slide, please. And it's an interesting study. So it took two cohorts. There was one born before 1955, so that's the first cohort. And there was another cohort born after 1974. And then it took a 10-year period, the first 10 years of this century, and it asked how skills intensity evolved, right? So what you found was that there was very little change in the composition of these skills, these skill breakdowns, for the older cohorts. But there was actually a lot of change for the younger cohorts. And you can see that reflected in these two charts. So what it suggests is that there are some kinds of industries, if you like, where young people are not entering. right? They're not entering these industries. Where the young people do enter, there's a lot of innovation in the way the skills are evolving. But the old industries, the less productive industries, they stay pretty much the same. So I think that's an interesting exercise, and it's interesting because you do have the two cohorts, you do have a reasonably substantial time period, and you do have this breakdown of occupations into skills. Next slide, please. So there are a few studies which look at age-biased technical change. And the findings are a little bit mixed. The middle skills tend to lose out, and that's true more generally. And we saw that in that earlier slide when we looked at those middle skills. But when they're older, when people are older and they have those middle skills, that routine skill, they're less able to adapt because of their age. So that might be because of their age itself, their individual characteristics, their drop-off in fluid intelligence. But it might also be because retraining is not directed towards those people, because the return on the retraining will be lower because they have less productive years or less years in the labour market left. So what we find is that there's a kind of mix depending on which study you use, and that mix hasn't fully been synthesized. So all I can do now is present you with a kind of subset of the studies which have been done. So what you might, one way of thinking about this is you might think of the age bias as skill bias, right? But without retraining adaptability, leaving that out. Next slide, please. So how do we conceptualize this? Well, we think of three groups of people which overlap. Right? And the first group are the ones that are affected by skill-biased technical change. Right? The second group are people that find skill updating more difficult. And then we just take older people. And in the middle there, in that heavily shaded shape, I don't really know what you would call it, right, where it says age-biased technical change, that's the group, right, which is being impacted and which is being reflected in the evidence that I have just presented to you. Next slide, please. So what do we say about this in terms of interim conclusions? Well, technology often impacts employment and wages, particularly of middle and lower skilled workers. And the pattern of employment amongst older cohorts suggests they're going to be more than proportionately caught up in this impact. So they're going to be kind of front and center. And their non-adaptability may slow growth, and it may lead to displacement. But what hasn't been tested, I think, is whether they would be open to retraining. And so I think it's an important question for the future. So next slide, please. How can technologies help with these aging pressures? That was our third question. There's just one slide on each of these last two, I think, as I recall. So next slide, please. So there are specific areas where you can see technologies helping aging pressures. And the most obvious and the best rehearsed is long-term care. So there's obviously increasing demand for long-term care as cohorts age, as more numerous cohorts age, and as people live longer, more generally. So there's increasing demand, and that demand has traditionally been highly labor intensive. It's kind of not exactly nursing, but it's in that direction. It's care. Okay? So the question is, could technology free up formal and informal labor which goes into that care? And the answer is pretty clearly yes. So assistive technologies, ICT, robots are all examples of this. Right? So just knowing that an older person who lives on their own is moving around their home, so recording the number of times the refrigerator gets opened in a day, is already very important information, especially for informal carers. And that's extremely simple, right? You can go a long way from there. So monitoring, and you can monitor health, of course, staying connected through internet, and task performance, simple task performance through robots. All these functions are going to be very important as technology plays into this area where demand overall will increase, and in an area where traditionally you have high labor intensity. Technical inducement externalities may then contribute to productivity growth. So some of the technology that has been developed to meet this demand may have applications elsewhere, and that may assist productivity growth more generally. I think health technology and aging are very closely related. First of all, there's a fiscal challenge with aging and health, as all of us will know. And then, well, can we use telehealth, right? So if we take just the Australian example for a minute, there's a study that was done here, which was focused on non-communicable diseases, chronic disease management. And there were two models. After you had been hospitalized for treatment for a chronic disease, on the one hand, you might be followed up by your specialist and then your GP over a period of time, and you're seen after your operation or whatever intervention had happened in the hospital. And then you're seen 3 months and 6 months and 9 months and so forth to check. Then there was another model where a monitoring machine was introduced to your home, and you tied yourself up to the monitoring machine a couple of times a week, and information was fed into a central control. And then if things got out of line, the central control alerted a medical professional. And what was found, right, in comparing these two groups was that in that second group, because of the very frequent monitoring, right, acute episodes of chronic diseases were anticipated. So you got dramatically lower mortality, you got dramatically low hospitalizations, because you're able to intervene. And this saves money. This plays directly into the fiscal challenge, because an enormous proportion of overall hospital costs are connected with non-communicable diseases, and they are predominantly occurring in older populations. And then there's digital identification technologies. So in some countries like Indonesia, actually tracking people and knowing who they are, digital identification may help with that. And that may help, right, to develop social protection, to develop other mechanisms that allow, and other mechanisms that allow actually formalization. And formalization, formal workers are much more productive than informal workers. So that's another avenue through which you may find that the technology is improved, productivity is improved via this induced technology. Next slide, please. So the final question for you all is, which policy and research can help? So I think, next slide, please. So I think in terms of policy challenges, we have human resource policies, right? Like education and training, getting the basics right so people can relearn later in life. And I wonder whether you could have a technology adjustment assistance program. So the US actually has a trade adjustment assistance program. So if trade opens up and people are pushed out of work as a result, there's an assistance program which allows them to adjust, right? I wonder if you could do the same thing for technology adjustment. And in that way, try to develop more comprehensive lifelong learning programs, which are actually focused on getting people productive, focused on what they might do for, in terms of market connection, labor market connection later in life. And then there are other policies like migration policy. There is no question that migration from low productivity economies to high productivity economies can change this whole equation of productivity and growth. And then there's inequality, right? And you really can't get away from inequality because so much absent any kind of protective policy, right? Inequality will increase with these kinds, with technological development of the kind that we've been describing. So I think that suggests a life course approach to intervention to make sure that education and health and retraining takes place, and of course social protection. And the social protection is tied up with technological development in the way that I have already suggested. Next slide, please. So in terms of knowledge gaps, I think Asia lacks the data available in the OECD. We could use a lot more data. Employee-employer linked data, for example, skills data by age. And I think it would be very useful to have more comprehensive modeling on how demographic change impacted on production and consumption and trade. So some of that work is being done in CPAR, the center that I direct, but there's much that needs to be done. Workplace and job design. Can we redesign jobs so that people are able to stay at work for longer? They're able to cope with the jobs they're given better, that they're able to accommodate paid work with other caring responsibilities, for example. And then links between demography and productivity, the strength of that inducement effect that I was referring to. And then the links across countries, how consumption composition and endowments, as they change, how that generates trade and what can be done about that. And then retraining, as I've mentioned already. And then there's, well, should we do cost-benefit analysis for specific technologies, such as the digital information technology that I mentioned earlier? So I will leave it there. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Piggott. That is an excellent presentation, a very comprehensive coverage on aging, technology change, and policies. I am somewhat uplifted from the presentation, particularly on the Asian perspective, that Asian is in fact equally innovative. And the other thing is that aging is not all that dim prospect. People can still remain productive and learning. It's also very useful or thankful for me is Professor mentioned many areas for study and some of the things we need to do, including more data, more focus on particular areas. In a way that we have two speakers, so perhaps each of you can borrow a bit time. Originally we planned for 20 minutes, and if the content is a bit too many, we can extend a little bit. So let me now invite Professor Andrew Mason to make this discussion presentation, particularly on the demographic dividends. The first one, the second one, how that's evolving particularly in the Asian context. Professor Mason, please.
I said, thank you, Dr. Tong, for the introduction, and thanks to John for a very stimulating conversation. So, are Asia's demographic dividends disappearing? Well, that question has been answered many times, and it seems that they are. So the question really is, how fast are they disappearing, and what can we do to sustain them and to keep them from having too adverse an impact on standards of living? So next slide, please. So I'm going to draw heavily on national transfer accounts and work by the NTA network. So in short, the NTA quantifies how economic variables vary over the life cycle. There's a great deal more to it, and there's a lot of details, and you can go to references provided at the end of the presentation, or you can go to our website, www.ntaccounts.org, if you would like more information. Let me also say that we have recently constructed NTA indicators for 185 countries by combining our work on NTA with the UN World Population Prospects released in 2019. Next slide, please. I am going to emphasize aging economies in East and Southeast Asia. And so I wanted to mention the research leaders who have been responsible for constructing national transfer accounts. I suppose I should in particular mention for China, Shangke, Wangfang, and Kai Yang, and for Singapore, Christopher G. And so it's been very helpful that they have done this work. Next slide, please. So I want to start with life cycle fundamentals that really drives everything that we do in our project. So the basics are of course, that the young and the old consume a great deal more than they produce through their labor. We call this difference the life cycle deficit. Now, this is only possible because working age adults have life cycle surpluses. They are producing more through their labor than they consume. And so the surplus that we see at working ages funds deficits for children and seniors in two different ways. One, it funds them directly through transfers. Those can be family transfers, or it might be publicly funded transfers, pension plans and healthcare programs in particular. But also surpluses at working ages can fund deficits for seniors indirectly because we can use the resources we have at our working ages to accumulate assets, fund pension plans, or by owner-occupied residency, or build up a farm, or a privately owned business, or many other ways. So these fundamentals are common to all countries, but the details vary a lot across countries, and I'm going to emphasize some of that variation in the presentation. So next slide, please. So this is a way of formalizing in a very simplified terms the life cycle. This is per capita consumption and per capita labor income by age. This has been averaged for countries that fall into 4 income groups. So the upper left is low income countries. The bottom right is high income countries. You can see there are important differences. I suppose the most noticeable one is the difference in the pattern of consumption. So in high income countries, consumption rises fairly substantially with age, and a lot of this has to do with spending on healthcare. So, and then also I've shown the life cycle deficit in this figure for high income countries, and it's just the gap between what people are consuming and what they're producing through their labor. Next slide, please. So these national transfer account data interact with population aging to produce 2 broad economic challenges that I want to talk about today. One is slower economic growth. So the effective number of workers, which I'll define in a minute, is growing more slowly than the effective number of consumers. So why do I say effective number? Well, in a lot of work, people talk about the number in the working ages. But when we measure workers, we're incorporating the effects of labor force participation, hours worked, unemployment, and productivity by age. So that was something that John talked about a lot, and it would be interesting to see how we can relate those two concepts to each other. So far, we have not been able to do that. So the effective number of workers is growing more slowly than the number of consumers, and that's leading to slower economic growth. The second challenge I want to point to is the fact that not all people are equally affected by this, of course. And there's a resource shortfall that is particularly sharp for seniors. So the total life cycle deficit for seniors is rising very rapidly relative to total labor income. So we want to both raise standards of living in general, but we also want to make sure the standards of living of seniors are maintained. Next slide, please. So let's look at each of these. First, slower growth. The change in the rate of growth in the effective number of workers relative to the effective number of consumers is known as the first dividend. And this shows the values for 2020. And you can see that North Asia and some Southeast Asian countries fall in that zone with Europe and North America and North Asia and a few other, Australia and New Zealand, where the first dividend has turned negative. And of these countries, only China has a deep red shade that is visible. Hong Kong also does, but you can't see that here. And in China, the first dividend is minus 1.1% per annum right now. So this is a sharp headwind for economic growth. Next slide. So the first dividend for 8 aging Asian economies from 1970 to 2050 is shown in this slide. And you can see that, before, in most of these countries, before 2000 anyway, 2010, the first dividend was positive, and some of these years it was very strongly positive. So if we look at Korea, for example, or Singapore, well, let's see, Korea for sure, the growth is as much as 2% per year due to the first dividend. But this is ending now, and in 2020, all of these countries have a negative dividend shown in the last slide. And you can see that this is going to be negative for many years to come. It's not a temporary phenomenon. It's not like a recession where you recover after a couple of years. We're not going to recover from this phenomenon for the rest of our lifetimes. So we have to learn to live with it and how to deal with it. Next slide, please. So this shows the resource shortfall for seniors. So how this is calculated is that it is the old age deficit. That's for all seniors, all people 65 and older combined, expressed as a percent of total labor income. So in 2020, it was very high in China, and Japan, rather, 45% of total labor income. So that means that you would have to take almost half of all total labor income of everyone in Japan to fund the life cycle deficit of seniors during that year. Well, that's quite a difficult thing to try to do. The other countries, the shortfall is much smaller, but it's not insignificant. And it's also rising very sharply. In Hong Kong, it's expected to exceed Japan's 30 years from now. But in other countries, like in Korea and in Taiwan, we see that it's rising very sharply. Now, it's interesting, in China, it does not rise so sharply. And the reason for that is that consumption is relatively low in China as compared really with any other country that I know of in the world. And that's true at all ages, but it is also true for seniors. And so the funding needed to pay for that consumption is less in China for that reason. Now, that's not necessarily a goal that China wants to pursue. I'm sure that they would like to have higher consumption for seniors at other ages. So one of the things that they may want to do is increase consumption at older ages, and the life cycle deficit will commensurately rise. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there are three essential responses for supporting economic growth and meeting resource needs of seniors. And these have already been referred to some extent. And I know in China, they're talking about this right now rather extensively. But the first thing is to reform labor markets. This goes back to the idea of, well, if we are going to live longer, we're going to have to work longer. But I think there's certainly more to it than that. The second is investment in human capital. That includes investment in human capital in the conventional school-going ages, but also lifelong learning is very important, particularly if we're going to raise productivity in older workers soon. And then the third is having programs that allow for sustainable growth in resources for seniors. And these are a combination of transfers and asset programs that have to be addressed. Next slide, please. So let's talk about labor market reform first. So this is how we look at the labor market in NTA. This is average labor income by age. And so this is not labor force participation. It includes labor force participation, but it also includes, how much people make at each age, what their wage is, and so forth. So it's a broader measure that includes both the amount of work, but also the quality of that work. And so China and Vietnam really stand out, really in the world as well as in East Asia, but they stand out in that the labor income peaks at a very young age in both countries at around age 30, and it declines very sharply at older ages. I've used this 50% line to mark kind of something like retirement. It's not the same thing, but it's something like that. And so in China, by age 55, people are making 50% of what a person on average who is 30 to 49 makes. So, please go back to the previous slide. Thank you. Now, if we compare that with Japan, and you can see that it is much older, age 62 before we reach that 50% point. Okay, now please go to the next slide. So I thought it would be interesting to compare the retirement point of each of the Asian countries for which we have data, aging countries in Asia, with upper middle income countries and high income countries. So in upper middle income countries, on average, it's about 58 that this age is reached. It's 63 in high income countries. In the United States, it's 67. So the United States is very unusual. It has only a couple of other small countries have ages that are nearly as high. Well, I don't know what to make of this, but it suggests that an awful lot of space is available to not just to increase the amount of work, but also to improve the quality of work at older ages. We really want people to have more opportunities to work, but have better jobs when they get older. So next slide, please. So this is the second thing I want to emphasize, which is investment in human capital. So we know that when couples have fewer children, they often spend more per child. It's a logical thing that happens, but it's a good thing because it means that those children can be healthier and they can have more education and be more productive when they get to be older. But we know the same thing happens with public spending per child. We see this in countries around the world, that in countries where fertility is low, public spending per child and public spending, particularly on health and education per child, is higher. Well, this has very important implications for the impact of aging, because fertility is a source of population aging, and fertility is leading people to have fewer kids, but to spend more on those children. So what we're seeing in the workforce as we go down the path is that we have fewer workers, but they're more productive because they're more educated and they're healthier. And so this should play a very positive role in meeting the economic challenges that I referred to. Next slide. This shows some empirical evidence that reinforces that. On the vertical axis is human capital spending, total fertility rate on the horizontal axis. South Korea has a very high spending. That's a 7. What does that mean? That means that in South Korea, to raise a child from birth to adulthood, you would have to spend 7 years worth of labor income on health and education. So you can see that in other aging Asian countries that we have very high levels of spending on human capital. Okay, let's turn then to the third point, the third way we can deal with the challenges. Next slide, please. So we need to fund the life cycle deficit for seniors. Labor market reform and human capital investment help to reduce the life cycle deficit. The deficit may go up in China and Vietnam because of the low consumption, but we're going to need these programs, a combination of transfer programs and asset-based programs that can fund very large life cycle deficits for seniors. Next slide. I hear my 20 minutes is up, but I guess the moderator gave me a couple of extra minutes, so I will take that. Let me just say here that East Asian countries take a fairly balanced approach. I'm not going to dwell on this figure because it's a bit complicated, but they're relying heavily on assets and public transfers to fund old age needs, whereas a lot of European countries, for example, rely heavily on transfer programs. And so this, I think, provides a solid foundation for countries in Asia to meet the future needs of the elderly. Next slide, please. So the final thing I want to do is to compare two approaches. So you could fund old age needs in principle by just relying on transfer programs. So you can tax workers essentially and use that to pay for the life cycle deficit of seniors. And that orange line shows what the cost would be as a share of labor income in Japan, China, Korea, and Thailand. Well, it goes up very sharply in all of these countries, and it stays up at very high levels if we do not deal with the life cycle deficit. The alternative is to fund these programs. So we can do something like Singapore emphasized a lot. We can accumulate funds in pension programs, and then we can use those to pay for retirement later in life. And what you see is that during the early years, the cost of the funded system is much higher than for the transfer system. So, for example, if we look at Japan, it reaches a peak of around 40% of labor income. That's how much you would have to save to fund the retirement program fully in Japan in 2000. But then it declines. And so in the future, you see that these funded programs become sustainable at much lower costs than the transfer systems. So there's upfront burden, but there's a very substantial after the fact benefit from these programs. Now, I don't think either of these programs is realistic or should be pursued by themselves. They both have benefits and they have roles to play, and so, but they should both play a role, and it's very important that they do so. Next slide, please. So let me end here with some just very general comments. So aging is going to present very substantial economic challenges in East and Southeast Asia. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It will be difficult. I think it's likely that economic growth will slow. By that I mean per capita income or per capita consumption. And I think it will be a challenge to meet economic needs of seniors. There could be serious political problems that arise. There could be generational conflict. I don't know that this needs to happen, but it's certainly something to think about. And there's a lot of steps, though, that we need to take and I think can really help. So first and foremost is labor market reform, creating an environment where people can work longer in highly valued and useful jobs. Second is human capital investment, both for young people, but also lifelong learning programs are going to be very important as people work longer. And then finally, a balanced approach to meeting old age needs are essential. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mason. Lots of thought-provoking discussion. And I also want to thank Professor Piggott for staying for us. I got a bit confused about your time over there. So it's anyway. Thank you. We are moving on to the next part of our panel, which is the question and answer session. Our plan was for the session is up to 11:40. We might extend a little bit depending on how our discussion goes. So I'm waiting for to be switched to another. Not switch. Getting something adding in so that I can look at the questions from the audience, and also from. I'm also going to be able to look at our other panelists who might have questions on site Okay, look, I'm seeing some questions now. Let's see, there's 3. Okay, first, I don't think I have time to do too much change. Let me just ask the first question for Professor Piggott. This is from Dr. Tian of my institute. If the skill bias technology change is okay. So the questions are missing the last word. Technical change is in favor of younger cohort. Does it imply that the college age premium for younger cohort will be higher than that of older cohort? This point is also related to those policy implications you discussed. So that's the first question. Okay, go. Yeah. So let me just look at the questions and Professor Piggott, would you like to take up this question for now?
Yes, I
About
think it's very
age.
difficult to say. I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
I think it's very difficult to say whether that is true, because you have cohort effect. So the college premium a generation ago was influenced by the fact that many fewer people went to college. And so there was a scarcity factor in college education a generation ago, which is less true now. Of course, technological innovation is ongoing. If you go back a couple of generations, the question was not whether you were computer savvy, it's whether you could drive. And whether you could drive or not was a big dichotomy in the labor force. If you had a driver's license, that opened up a whole slew of jobs that were not available if you didn't have a driver's license. Now it's kind of assumed more or less everyone drives. The question is, are you able to use a computer well or not? Right? So I think I do think that education will become increasingly important, but I don't think that you can infer that from the evidence that I've brought to the table today. It's more a general view that there's going to be a lot more capital intensity that requires high level cognitive skills. I think that will occur. Now, the other part of that question is, so supposing you are 45, right? Is it worth retraining you? Will you be open to retraining and able to adapt? And I think that question depends a lot on the kind of education that you have had in your 20s and in your teens. If you've gone through college and you have a flexible foundation, you might be adaptable to retraining. Other parts of your cohort may not be. So I think the generalization of more advanced education will lead to better adaptability of skills through the life course than we have observed in the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I'll have next have 3 questions, 2 for Professor Mason and 1 for Professor Piggott. The first 2 questions from my colleague, Dr. Li Yao. The question, she has 1 question each. So Professor Piggott, thank you for your very inspiring presentation. The question is about the modeling of aging issue for Asian countries. Are there any specific features of Asian countries' economies should be particularly pay attention to, such as the gender imbalance, migrant grandparents in China, and things like that. Dr. Lee's question to Professor Mason is, dear Professor, nice to see you again. I think she is a student at the University of Hawaii. Her question, she said, my question is about the COVID-19. As the pandemic has changed people's lifestyle and behavior a lot. Will they also change the demographic dividend modeling? Thank you. Another question for Professor Mason is regarding the financing of older age or the deficit. So the dilemma, this is from Dr. Jiang Minghua, also at the East Asian Institute. She said there is a dilemma when the government increases tax in order to finance the old age consumption deficit. It reduces the consumption potential of the younger population. How should we resolve that issue? So maybe I'll start with Professor Mason first for the two questions, and then Professor Piggott.
Sure. So, COVID-19. So, yeah, the one thing I think that is, there's some things that are clear. One is that COVID-19 is going to adversely affect public finances. And so that's going to make it harder for governments to fund aging programs that are going to take up an increasingly large share of resources. I'm hopeful that those resource demands won't be too great, and I don't think they are all that large as compared with the resources that aging could potentially require. But it will add a level of difficulty. Will it change behavior? Well, I guess the other thing that I worry most about is education. I've really emphasized that in my presentation, that it's critical that we educate the young so that they are able to fuel economic growth and provide some seniors. And I have no idea how COVID-19 is affecting the education system outside the United States, to be honest. But I worry about the United States and other countries as well. Let's see, the second question was about how do we finance the needs of the elderly without taxing younger generations. Well, I think we'll have to. In the past, the things that we've looked at have shown that working age adults are willing to pay more for young people and for seniors. So a lot of us, I think, have been worried that, for example, young people might be disadvantaged because of the impact of seniors, but that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, young working age adults and middle-aged adults seem to be willing to provide a lot of resources to support children and support seniors. And I think they're going to have to do that as well in the future, hopefully at not too excessive levels. But I think taxes are going to have to go up in Asia to fund social programs. Hope that answers your questions.
Professor Piggott, there is a question from Dr. Li Yao.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So what I have in mind, I guess, are these kinds of features, and I think they're true of a number of emerging economies in Asia to a greater or lesser extent. These economies have all experienced, to a considerable degree, very substantial regional migration from rural to urban sectors over the past generation, sometimes past 10 years, sometimes the past 30 years, but in all cases. And they have experienced declining fertility, and they have experienced longer life expectancy. They also operate with very, very substantial informal sectors. So numbers like 70 and 80% even in some Asian economies, that's the proportion of the labor force operating in the informal sector. So that suggests to me that there are major social forces operating, social and economic forces operating, I suppose I should say, which will require considerable agility on the part of policymakers to prevent enormous hardship, particularly amongst older people, because you're going to observe people who are now kind of old but active, right? Moving to a point where they are old and inactive, and there aren't going to be the children at home that there were a couple of generations ago. There will be remittances, but of course, care for the elderly is very dependent upon informal care, actual presence. And I think there needs to be innovative social policy development to meet that. Now, how do you model that? How do you design policies which reach out and provide protection to people who have spent most of their lives in the informal sector of the economy? So I think we need to do this at a number of levels, and I think it is being addressed, although not comprehensively, at the kind of coalface level, right? So there are various countries in Asia which have developed pilot programs or community programs to anticipate this need or to meet it where it already exists. But there is a broader question of how you design policies that allow the governments to protect these people, pay transfers to these people without discouraging formalization. And I think that's a very, very challenging operation. And for that, you need more aggregate models. You need to think of models that have the interactions of labor force and human capital accumulation, and formal, informal choices, right? And developments in terms of formal opportunities altogether. And those models really don't exist at the moment. We have them in developed economies. So, the Congressional Budget Office or the Australian Treasury, or whatever, they exist. They don't exist with the kind of structure that operates in a lot of these emerging economies. So that's really what I was reaching for. I think those kinds of issues. I suppose the other issue that I'm concerned about that I think needs to be represented that I didn't mention was co-residency. So I think the changing pattern of co-residency is important in this context because transfers to one generation may well end up impacting other generations, especially in countries where co-residency.
Thank you. Obviously, these are very complex and also changing dynamic issues. I have two more questions, and both speakers may have some input or response. The first one is about China's, as we see that the labor income slightly after 50 years, then the labor income drop considerably. So in that sense, it's very much related to China's relatively lower retirement age. So extending that retirement age, man or woman, has been under discussion for some time. There's still in not quite clear policy. However, in practice, for employers, firms often, when they hire, they often specify a maximum age for applicants. So that's quite common practice for China's labor market. So how do you see that contradiction in terms, on one hand, you actually facing an old age issue, and you one thing you need to do is to extend the working age. On the other hand, the practice is still very age discriminative. And the other related question is, we have been talking about lifelong learning in human capital investment, in skill up, upgrade. Is there an issue? Is there a question to think about lifelong working, particularly in certain jobs, certain types of jobs that knowledge accumulation is more important, and also when working is actually a pleasant thing it's part of a human need, at least for part of the population. So those are two questions quite relevant or related. I wonder if both of you can have something to enlighten us on those issues. Professor Piggott, do you want to go first?
Okay. No, I think I'll go second. Let me go second on this.
Okay, Professor Mason, your turn then. Yeah, sorry. You have a choice.
Well, let's see. So, to some extent, aging is going to take care of part of this problem because there aren't going to be any young workers. And so employers may want to have young workers, but they're going to start turning to older workers and realizing that that's what they need to take advantage of. Then there's also a role for government regulation to play. I've always been shocked when I see these advertisements in papers in Asian countries saying, I want a young, attractive 30-year-old, to come and work at my firm. Boy, that would not go anywhere in some other countries like the United States. This is absolutely illegal to do something like that. And, the U.S. rarely does anything right, but I would say that one thing they have done right is to say you should be able to work as long as you want. The government should not be telling you that you have to retire. If an employer wants to hire you and you're doing a good job, then the employer should be perfectly free to do that. I know people who are very capable who are told they have to retire because they reach some arbitrary age, but nobody wants them to retire. And I think these kinds of practices, there are many of them, need to be eliminated, and I hopefully that will happen over time.
So my turn. So there are a couple of questions here, I think. One relates to employer attitudes toward older workers. And in Australia, like in the US, there's no retirement age, right? You can't be terminated on the basis of your age. That's illegal. And so some people do work very late. Academics work very late, for example, and into late life. But if you talk to labor market consultants, right, big firms hire to hire people, often they are told implicitly or explicitly that the firm is not interested in anyone over the age of 45. Now, it's very difficult to legislate against that, right? That's a kind of conversation that someone has. But I think that does play out in the experience of people who are trying to find work in later life. So it takes, if you're 55 and older, it can take twice as long to find a job as if you're 35. Right? And that's not because the 55-year-olds are incompetent. It's because employers tend to prefer younger workers. And so there is that, I think, workplace ageism which exists, and it's a complicated thing to resolve. There are questions of networks, there are questions of whether older and younger people can work well together, and so forth. So I think it's a complicated issue, but I think it's a very important issue. It's a little bit like the question of sexism a generation ago. Right? If you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, then women, right, once they married, they were sort of expected to move out of the labor force, right? That kind of thing. I think it's got some elements in common with that. And that's changed. Not perfectly, but changed very substantially from where it was. And I think this will too, but it might take another generation. The question of lifelong learning and when you should stop work. I agree with Andy that we shouldn't have policies which lead people to be forced to retire through penal tax rates. So features of retirement systems, such as earnings tests, really should not exist. We should get rid of those. But I think countries have done that. My understanding is that the Chinese employee pension system doesn't have an earnings test. You can start taking your pension and continue to work, but there is nevertheless an expectation that you'll take lower paid work. Right? A lot of people move from higher paid work to lower paid work in their 50s. That's not true in Australia. People tend to start to drop out of the labour force at 60 or 63, right? But the transition doesn't exist in the same way. So pushing retirement age up is one way of doing this. Another way is to offer the retirement pension at the age, but discount it further. Say, if you work for longer, you get much more. And of course, that's what does happen in the US. So the difference between 60 and I think it's 72, Andy will correct me, is very dramatic for social security entitlements. So that is another possible way forward in this question. Thank you.
Thank you.
You get a 7% premium for each additional year you work beyond age 62. Up
62.
until you get to from 62 to 70. You get that premium.
Okay. Thank you. With the privilege of a moderator, I would like to ask two very simple, quick questions. For Professor Mason, I just curious question about the per capita consumption and labor income by age. When you have the four income group countries, and interestingly, from the lower middle income to upper lower income, it seemed to be the trend that moving not toward the upper income, not toward the rich high income country. I wonder if the China factor is there that's affecting this part. That's my question for Professor Mason. And I have a small question for Professor Piggott as well. The graph on skill bias technological gap change, we see that China's gained considerably in the middle range. You mentioned about offshoring. I see that there's some losses in that category from countries like Malaysia and the Philippines that might consistent with your explanation or your understanding. I'm thinking about the next 10 years, as you mentioned that might change. So my question is, how does aging parameter will have an impact on regional supply chain, or in part offshoring, onshoring, that dimension So that's a question related to that particular graph. So who might go first?
I can go first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is the
You're
last
absolutely
question.
right. You're absolutely right about China's being the reason why the upper middle income countries look like that. And these profiles are value weighted. So China has a big impact on those profiles. If you just take a simple average of the profiles for countries, it doesn't look like that. It goes up from the upper middle income countries are more like the high income countries.
Professor Piggott, you have any thing to add?
Well, I don't have strong insight. My sense is that offshoring perhaps has had its day, that we've done as much as we can, and that um, uh, artificial intelligence may well lead to some onshoring. Because after all, it's expensive to transport manufactured goods. If you can manufacture them with very capital intensive techniques using artificial intelligence, then it's possibly better to do that domestically. And so I think the pattern of trade will change over the next period with that kind of technological development. And we won't be observing that offshoring phenomenon that we currently do, or at least did up until 2010 in China.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's a very rich and stimulating discussion. I have gained a lot of understanding, and I'm hoping to have more learning exchange with both, and also the question and answer sessions. I wonder if Professor Hoffman have anything to add or conclude for our instructions for the coming sessions. Let me thank both speakers and participants and the people who posted questions, and thank you very much. Professor Hoffman.
So let me say just thank you to you.
Thank you. Sorry.
And it was good to see you, Andy.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks again.